Welcome to Growing Your Firm, brought to you by Jetpack Workflow. We're here to help firms unlock the secrets to help you reach your goals faster. And now, here's your host, founder and CEO of Jetpack Workflow, David Cristello.
Hey everybody, David Cristello here, founder and CEO of Jetpack Workflow and host of the Growing Your Firm podcast. Today's guest is John Seiffer. Now, John has been a business owner for over 40 years. He's been a remote CEO in the 90s, since the 90s, so he was remote before people probably have been saying remote. Been a business coach for 25 years and past president of the International Coach Federation. John has been on our podcast 2, 3, 4 times. John, your smoking jacket, Louds jacket is in the mail. You are at our summit, you've spoken a lot, and you are the systems guy, which is why I was so excited when you wrote this book called Overthinking. We're going to dive into how to apply this to make managing your team a lot easier. We're going to maybe get into the wonderful world of culture, values, and attitude, and it's not the way in which most of our audience will think, and maybe a little bit more. But John, first off, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Greg. Great to be here. I have been here, I think, 3 times already, and it's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, first question, why go through what I assume is the pain of writing a book in the first place?
Good question. I've actually been writing a blog since, I think, 2006. I don't know if anybody ever followed it, but I enjoy the writing process, or at least I enjoyed the blog process. What I found is there's similar patterns that I've seen with my clients, and I thought it would be useful to put them all together into a book. The process of writing a book-length thing was harder than I thought. I had a terrific editor who just tore the first draft to shreds, and she was right, and it worked out great. It ended up being a lot of fun.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
So what are some of the common patterns? What's an example that comes to mind that you...
Yeah. So I'd like your readers to think about the last person they hired. Get that person's name, face in your mind. And then, or I guess it's your listeners. Sorry about that. I'm so into writing. I'd like your listeners to think about the last person they've hired. Get their name, face in their mind. And then think about why they hired them. And what I mean is not why they hired them compared to the other candidates at the time, but why they hired somebody in that slot in the first place. And the answer for everybody is you hired them to produce something, to do some work, some output, what I call outputs. If you're a restaurant, you might want them to produce hamburgers. If you hired a salesperson, they produce sales. And whatever they produce, those are the outputs that you expect. Now, the next step is, what's the biggest frustration that managers and owners have with their employees? It's that they don't produce the outputs that they were expecting. And the flip side is the biggest frustration that employees have with their boss is they thought they were doing the right outputs, but the boss didn't think so. So there's that disconnect. And the source of that disconnect tends to be that people hire with the thought of a job description or a title, a place in the org chart, rather than actual list of outputs. And when you break that down, and as a manager, you really define what outputs you expect this person to produce to be a good employee, and you explain it very concretely, it makes it much easier to manage that person. It makes it easier to hire that person in the first place because you both agree what you're looking for. And it makes it easier to do things like performance reviews, give feedback, et cetera, because you have defined those outputs in measurable, visible ways, and it's completely transparent to both of you.
So what's an example where they have the job description? Because everybody has a job description. They'll post it up. There's a million job description templates. Maybe they had one in the past. Maybe they Google search for one. So what would a job description sound like that differs from a list of outputs?
So a job description starts with a title. So let's take a title like marketing director. In some companies, the marketing director actually writes the social media posts, they post stuff, they do the analysis. In other companies, bigger companies perhaps, that same title person, their outputs are a marketing plan, a marketing budget. They're hiring the people who do the other stuff. So the title is very disconnected from the actual outputs. And the job description will typically say things like, you're responsible for XYZ, you report to this person. They don't say, you will produce this many job posts or blog posts a day or social media posts a week or whatever it is. They aren't that specific. And the job description actually should be that specific, so specific that you could use that same job description as somebody's 60-day or 6-month performance review, where they come in. And it also then helps with the hiring to be able to go back and say, has this person ever done any of this kind of thing before? So
So
that's the
where do you,
difference.
I love that. Where do you break the line of, okay, let's keep running downfield with the marketing director. So maybe the output is writing 5 blog posts a week. How does something like output then interact with metrics for that position, right? So maybe the metric is increase organic search or something, right? Or whatever it may be. Do you put that in the same box, or is it depending on the seniority of who you're hiring, whether they actually think about the metrics in the first place?
Well, they're related, and it depends on the level of the position. In some positions, the output is entirely controlled by the person. So how many social media posts you put on, how quickly you do the analysis of the analytics, for example. The response to that is dependent on your response that's not under your control. So how quickly people will re-engage or repost or things like that. And so you can separate those into 2 different categories. Ultimately, you want, generally when you're in a marketing or sales direction, you want that response. And so if they just do, let's say, take a salesperson, they do the right number of calls, but they're not really good. They don't say the right things. They don't dance with the people they talk to. They're not getting the results. And so you need to have both of those.
That makes a lot of sense. So if you're a marketing director, but maybe you report up to somebody that's responsible for the entire department, they might be more broad-based metric driven. I guess for our community, it would be like if you hire somebody and, the goal would be, something around, I would just do something simple here, closing out a certain number of client projects every week, right? You're responsible, whether it's tax returns or running payroll or closing the books, you're responsible for making sure it gets done on time. Now there's the other one, which is like, yeah, and don't leave it riddled with mistakes, right? Like you have to do these things, but there's a check and balance between client satisfaction and then the quality of the work that you're doing, right?
Yeah, so you can define outputs in terms of quality. You can't just say, okay, this number of returns, tax returns, let's say, but they have to be then reviewed. And so they have to pass review. So you can define the quality when it's appropriate in your definition of those outputs. You can also define, there's a lot of things that go into outputs that you don't realize are outputs until you think about it. So in a production environment, whether it's tax returns or making widgets or whatever, that's easy to define. Usually the closer you are or the worker is to the customer, the easier it is to define those outputs. When it comes to knowledge work, it's a little more tricky. Making decisions, though, is an output. Relationships are an output. Business development people typically have those outputs. When somebody's buying a company or doing mergers and acquisitions, the owner has a lot of relationships, and those relationships need to be considered as outputs. And who's going to replace them when that person leaves? The other thing about outputs is when people are producing these outputs and your company is benefiting from that, if you're going to promote somebody, you want to make sure that 2 things, that they are capable of producing the outputs in their new job, and that somebody is backfilling the gap that they leave behind in terms of the outputs that they were producing. So you need both.
As a firm owner, maybe a silly question here. What are the outputs of a business owner? Well, and we'll assume a smaller team here, right? Well, I don't know.
Yeah. So 8 to 10, 12 people, maybe. 2 parts. The outputs of the business itself, Peter Drucker said, the purpose of a business is to create a customer. and customer, somebody that pays you, and they pay you because you give them something that they value more than they value their money. So the business needs to do all that to produce customers and ultimately a profit. The business owner should think about, why are they in this business in the first place at this time in their life? There are things that they want from their company that are not necessarily related to their vision for the company.
Interesting.
Obviously, there's three things that everybody wants that I've found. Everybody wants more money. People want more time, usually time away from work. And people want work that they love. Those three, in my experience, are universal. The fourth one that's more prominent today, because it's more possible with the internet, is people want to live where they want to live, that may be independent of where the company is. So there's many more remote CEOs and remote owners, like I was back in the day. So that's the fourth thing that's sometimes universal. And then I've collected about 20 different other things that people want that are not universal at all. Some people want to travel, so they build their company in a way that they can travel and have clients and maybe locations and employees all over the place. Some people hate to travel, so they build their company slightly different. Some people have a mission about their business. Some people they want to be famous. Some people want their business to launch them into the next phase of their life, whether it's philanthropy, politics, maybe building a holding company, whatever it is. So there's a lot of things people want from their companies. And I think it's important to get those things out on the table because they will influence your business decisions. And if you don't put them consciously up on the table, they'll be influencing them in non-conscious ways, which isn't usually as effective. So two parts to that. The company needs to do some stuff, and the owner needs to figure out, why are they there?
Dealing with, and I put myself in this bucket to some extent, highly analytical folks. I guess one of my worries here is when you think about these items is you can overthink it. So, for example, we talk about freedom from the business, so time off. Well, how much time off is enough time off to feel like I have a green check mark with the appropriate amount of time off? Is it 10 days, 15 days, 3 weeks, a month unplugged? I don't know. It's like, I don't know. It's more of a feeling, I guess. But that could just be because you didn't sleep that week, right? And likewise with reviewing tax returns, is it 80% approval, 90% approval, 85% approval, 60% get passed through? So at what point are you kind of procrastinating through overthinking, maybe sometimes with this stream of conscious?
I don't think you can overthink the outputs if you tie them to things that actually make sense either for the business or for your personal life. So just because you've had a bad day, that doesn't mean, oh, I need to take a vacation. You have to have a little discipline if you're running a company. But you do get to know yourself. And as your life changes, you have more kids or the kids go to college and you have fewer kids at home, you can change a lot of that stuff as long as you understand the ramifications in the business. One of the things I've seen with smaller firms, and I mean companies under about 5 million in revenue, which is usually under 20, 25 people, somewhere in there, depending on the industry. Many owners are very intuitive and not procedural. And so they think all this stuff depends on them. And it's because they're really good at just jumping in and fixing stuff, but they're not good at making a process for other people to do it better. And when that happens, if you can get things into more of a process, you may find that things don't depend on you as much. And you actually can spend more time doing other things. Maybe it's growing the business. Maybe that's what you want to do. So you move into a more strategic role or a more growth-oriented role. It may be you want to do something else. Maybe you're looking at another business to either start or acquire. Maybe you want to do something else personally and the business serves you in that way. So it's looking at that stuff with an open mind. The difference between the intuitive part and the procedural part, I call it the grandmother in the kitchen who makes great food but doesn't follow a recipe. Thanksgiving dinner is wonderful, but you can't build a restaurant around grandma. Grandmas are hard to scale and they're hard to find and they're expensive. But if you look at any sizable restaurant, you'll see the process. And much of the work is pushed down to the lower levels in the company, which is better for the customers actually, because you want decisions to be made at the lowest level possible. It's better for the employees because the lower level employees now have more power and they have more authority and they like that. It's better for the company because that's often lower cost. And it's better for everybody else because you end up, there's a difference between procedural knowledge and what's called tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is the stuff you can't put into words. It's like, how do you ride a bike? Well, if you know how to ride a bike, you know how to do it, but you can't teach somebody that just verbally. If you put the right processes in place to produce the right outputs, then more and more people are working most of their time using their tacit knowledge. And so grandma is in there saying, oh, you know what? We need to tweak this recipe a little bit so it has more salt. She needs to know that. But then once she's figured that out, somebody else can put the salt in.
She can
And
taste it. She's the taste expert, right?
yeah, yeah.
Knows
Or
exactly
she's,
how it should taste.
in a restaurant, it would be the executive chef who's designing the menu. But they don't do that every day. They do that once. And then other people make sure that it happens on a regular basis.
So in your years of coaching, what are some of the, we'll call it, silliest things owners have held on to that they should have pushed the decision down? Either common ones or just so like this was a little ridiculous. This was over control freak moment for somebody.
Yeah. So I had a client. He ran a small law firm, and his entire workforce had walked out on him twice. Now, not all at once, but he had 2x turnover in the time before he hired me. And the thing he was holding on to was the frugality of being an entrepreneur in a small and startup company. And so I got him to at least start having meetings with his staff and just say, how things going? What do you need? What do you want? And he came back to me one day and he said, these people want one of those bottled water services where you have the water cooler and somebody brings up a 5-gallon jug every week and whatever. And he said, I worked out the numbers and it's more expensive per gallon than gasoline. And I said, you're thinking about it totally wrong. You're not buying a liquid. You're paying for happy employees. And do what you need to do to make your employees happy and give them a good work environment. And that will be worth the money. And so he it's very common for entrepreneurs, and I'm like this as well, particularly when you're starting a company. You're frugal, but you don't want to hold on to that frugality, either force it on other people, or there also becomes a time as the company grows where you have to switch and you say, you know what, it's worth it to pay people, to pay contractors, to pay coaches, to pay when you're hiring employees, to pay more to get a better quality employee. And so that's a big shift. And holding on to that frugality is a very interesting one.
Nice. Do you have any other decisions that you've seen clients or again, one-off or commonalities that, so I'll give an example. As I remember this accounting firm owner from years ago, and he had $1 million firm and he was answering the calls.
Yeah.
Like he didn't have front staff, and it was like, well, you're profitable, right? Oh yeah, we're doing really well. And you're answering the phones. Yeah. Stop answering the phones. Well, clients expect me to answer the phone, so I like to answer the phone. It kind of felt, but eventually he got somebody. He was also burning out from his firm, and that's why we're talking. And then we're like, oh, you're answering all of the phone calls.
Right. Yeah, I definitely owners should man the phones once in a while to stay in touch, but not to do it all the time. And that's a case where you need to educate the customer. Here's how our process works. I know of a law firm who had 6 partners, and they would spend an hour every day going through the mail. Just, oh, this is yours, this is mine, this is administrative. It's like, you guys, what's your billing rate in an hour? And there's 6 of you, that kind of stuff is just, people get into those habits. I was working with a company back in the olden days when there used to be phone books, and they had a series of local phone books for local cities, and they did all the invoicing. And I said, well, you have a bookkeeper, why don't they do it? Well, we've given certain deals to certain people, and we kind of know what those are. I said, well, first of all, how many? Um, that's one of the things when you get into processes and outputs, you're not going to get all the edge cases. And it turned out 85, 90% of them were not edge cases at all. So the first step was just have your bookkeeper do those and put a note that they have to talk to you about these other edge cases. And that saves some time. The next step is when the bookkeeper starts a new customer, put those details in at the first place and they can do the edge cases. They don't have to do everything exactly the same. If you have that information, you just need to pass that information on to them.
Yeah, that feels like an indirect ad for Jetpack Workflow. So if you're struggling to put notes anywhere for your clients, please call
Yeah.
us. Please send us an
Well,
email. Please visit the site.
that's one of the things we've worked together for a while in the past. And one of the things I love about Jetpack and you aren't paying me to say this, is that it makes the work of an accounting firm into more of a process and procedure. And so then it can scale. And what I say is the company needs outputs produced. If those outputs are all produced intuitively, like grandma in the kitchen, they're not going to be scalable. But once those outputs can be systemized where it's repeatable, then it can be scalable.
Absolutely, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So I think one of the traps I've fallen into this so many times, I know some of the firm owners that listen fall into this, is you're watching YouTube, you're listening to a podcast, you grab a book, and the book says something very tactical. Well, you need to run Google ads, or you need to hire an assistant, or you need to, whatever it may be, you need to go into this type of service offering. You need to redo your pricing. You need to redo your packaging. When you're talking about the lawyers in the mail, the question I was going to ask was like, well, that's kind of interesting. Made me think of firm owners and their email. And then it made me think of, I went down a path of read a book, book said, well, to do things right, you should hire an assistant. Hired assistant to run my email. And what I found that I was somewhere between saving probably 10 minutes a week to losing 30 minutes a week. And part of that was maybe the system that was set up, but part of it's like I just don't get that much email. Right. And so I lacked first principle thinking about the advice, from the book. And I think that's a common trap that I think output thinking is trying to avoid, which is trying to identify the bottlenecks to the next level of your firm versus chasing tactical advice on what's happening in other people's business. Would you kind of agree with that sentiment? Am I kind of on track or off track here?
Yeah, no, I think you are on track. I think one of the problems with general business advice, and you see this really a lot in social media, where there's very short list of how many characters you can put in a tweet, for example. People write what I call bumper sticker tweets that they make it sound like it applies to everybody all the time, and rarely is that the case. So the best business advice has context around it. Try this for this reason. Try this in this situation. Here's how to think about this. When I work with a client individually, I know how they're thinking about something. I know the context of their business, so I can be much more directive with advice. When I'm tweeting on social media, it tends to be general. Here's how you think about something. I hope that the book is more about here's how you think about it and apply it to your particular situation. The thing about email, which is a very common bottleneck for people, is when you're frustrated with your email situation, you think of email as one thing. Oh, I get so many emails. Oh, I got this many, I'm spending all this time on emails. It's like, well, emails are a tool for something. What are you doing with that tool? You don't see a contractor or a carpenter say, well, I'm spending all my time with hammers. That's a problem. What are you doing with that hammer? And the thing about email is usually there's somewhere between 6 and 10 different things that you're doing with your email. And before you can hand off email effectively, you have to identify what are the different things that the email is for and how is the response different for each one of those. And when you do that, you find that some of them can be much more easily outsourced. And by outsourced, I mean maybe somebody in your office, maybe it's somebody overseas, maybe it's just a remote or a rote cut and paste kind of thing. It can be done simply by somebody else, but not all of them can. And you want to be able to have the ones that take it require your insight and only look at those. And so
Yeah.
if you can break down that block of things called emails into the subsystems and the subparts of that, it makes it easier to hand off and get rid of a lot of the time sink.
I love that. Yeah, it makes me think for our firm owners, it could be there's client requests. So something's come up. They got a letter from the IRS. They have a request for a certain report. There's status updates. I sent you this thing. What's the update tax return, whatever it may be. There's maybe business development and sales. Could be team member, although a lot of that's moved to Teams or Slack. Could be that, or could be systems like Jetpack emailing you. And then it could be like industry news. So there's shifts in the tax law, there's shifts in that. And so like each one of those things requires a different mindset of who should be triaging it and how it should be triaged. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and each one of those things has a different response time attached to it.
Yeah.
And for example, many business owners think, well, I have to be available to my clients 24/7. And rarely is that actually the case. What clients mostly want to know is that you've got it under control, which may mean an immediate response in business hours. That's even if the response is, I've got it under control, I'll get back to you in 2 days. I've looked at this, I've thought about it, doesn't need a response in the next 30 minutes. We'll get to it. And that puts clients at ease. Another part of it is educating clients about how quickly things and how things work. Here's what to do after hours if you get a letter from the IRS. The IRS is not knocking on your door. There is time to respond to that letter. And if you can tell them somebody in our firm who's capable will handle that, it doesn't always have to be the business owner. And in some cases, as the firm gets larger and people get more specialized, those things are not best handled by the business owner. A very, specific nitty gritty kind of response is sometimes better researched by somebody else. And they just need to know that.
In the world of creating procedures, something that came to mind was, from personal experience, I remember this was a number of years ago, we were creating a internal process. And we were creating so many exceptions and what if scenarios because we kept thinking of a team member that was abusing the system essentially. We're like, well, if they do that, it puts so many guardrails and so many safeguards and so many exceptions that actually going through that process, we realized maybe this isn't the right team member. I mean, this is becoming very complicated. Even though, they're doing quite well tactically at their job, organizationally, it's becoming a nightmare. So as you're going through output thinking and you're creating procedures, I guess, is there a line of which you're like becoming so detailed in your documentation that it's really just that's a staffing problem at that point?
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the things that documenting those outputs and describing them in very particular ways allows you to see when it's an actual personnel issue. And a lot of times you can just say, you know what, we need common sense here.
Yeah.
And,
We were trying to institutionalize common sense and at one
yeah.
point, and we're like, we
And
need
if
to
you
stop.
look at, bureaucratic company policies, a lot of times you'll see a rule and you go, man, that must have been an interesting story that started that rule.
Mhm.
you know, And if you can just work back to common sense, I had a company, the company that I lived 1,500 miles away from for 23 years, it was basically a warehouse. We were selling movie libraries to apartments and we shipped them around. And because we were using UPS and FedEx a lot, I said to employees, look, if you need to send a package once in a while, go ahead. Just put it on the company tab. Not a big deal. But there was one employee that was abusing that. And I could have said, okay, here's the limit of how many packages a week or a month or whatever. I just talked to her and I said, hey, I think you're abusing the thing. And she eventually left, not just because of that incident, but she was not the right person for the mentality of the team. Yeah, so you can do that in a lot of ways.
I think that's a good segue. There's a couple different ways we can go into, but before we wrap up here, I would love to then segue into, okay, so we just talked about how common sense sometimes isn't so common amongst the team, and this person didn't have the same team mentality. So having said all that, help me unpack. You presented this topic over pre-interview. You said why I hate the words culture, values, and attitude.
Yeah, I love
So
the
for me, I'm sorry.
concepts.
Yeah,
And
go ahead.
so it's a little clickbaity question. I love the concepts of culture, values, and attitudes, but the words, the way they're normally used, they're not described in visible, measurable outputs. So if you have a culture of teamwork, what does that mean? How would you see if somebody was a team player or not? Some people would say, well, a team, good person on a team, they pull their own weight. They, they do everything themselves. Others would say they ask for help when they need it. Others would say they jump in when somebody else needs help without being asked. Those are all measurable, visible behaviors, but they're different. And if you have a value of teamwork or honesty or trust, you may have very different behaviors in mind than somebody else. And if you don't describe those things, you'll get into saying, oh, that person has a bad attitude. Oh, what do you mean? Well, they show up late. They don't make eye contact. They don't speak in meetings. Those are all visible behaviors. And if
Mm.
that's what you mean by a bad attitude, then describe it that way. Now, you can use those words and say, as described by or as measured by, things like that.
Yeah, well, I think probably one of the hardest things on that front then is kind of start your firm. You have either listed out or you try to, through osmosis, prescribe these values, but you've never had to go back and think about what that actually means. And so it feels like it's almost inevitable that you have to go through a couple iterations of working with hiring staff that don't exhibit that for you to then surface what exactly you mean by that. I mean, maybe there's the atypical case where they come into their business and they write it all down. They know exactly what it looks like. But I think for many, they have to go through the experience of getting the scar tissue to say, okay, we show up on time, we do what we say, all the, we body language is important, whatever it may be.
Yeah. And so what you don't want to do is just say, well, that person didn't fit our culture. We got rid of them and we're looking for somebody better. You want to say, why did that person not fit our culture? What did I notice about that person? And so one exercise that you can do is you can say, imagine two people. One is a good fit. One is a great fit. What do you see differently about those people that indicates one is okay and one is great? And those things that you see will be the difference. Like, what would you see in let's take friendliness as an attitude. Well, what would you see in a friendly customer service person? Tone of voice, kinds of questions that they ask, how they respond to customer complaints. Those are all behaviors that can be trained, modified, and measured. But to just say they feel friendly, that's not very useful.
Yeah. All this reminds me as we wrap up, I think, I don't know if we talked about this on the pod or not, but just how it's, at times seemingly unnatural this is to write these things down. I mean, most people are not having a book of what they mean or having a checklist of what they mean by friendly or teamwork or trust or integrity.
Yeah.
And it's a skill. I mean, maybe there's this weird, human out there that just has thought of this world in this way from day one. But I mean, it's a skill. It has to be developed because you're not running around with your friends debating, the checklist of friendliness, for example.
Well, running a business is an unnatural act, and it's going to take some unnatural work to do it well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, John, this has been great. Always appreciate having you back on. If our audience wants to reach out, connect with you, say thank you, learn more about the book, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
So outputthinking.com has a page about the book, has a table of contents, some other insights there, and of course, a link to Amazon where you can buy the book in paperback or Kindle form. You could just Google Output Thinking on Amazon. My website is ceobootcamp.com, and I'm on X, which used to be Twitter, at Better CEO.
Fantastic. Was it hard to get outputthinking.com?
Actually, no. It was
That's
right there.
incredible. That's incredible. I can't believe you've got outputthinking.com and not outputthinkingbook.com.
I got both, but outputthinking.com is better.
It
Shorter.
was available, or did you have
Yeah.
to pay?
No, it was there.
Fantastic. Well, kudos to you. I can't believe you got that domain. I guess, sometimes you get lucky. There's still some really great domains out there. John, appreciate you coming back on the show. For our audience, you couldn't write down all the points that John had talked about today. We're going to link everything up at jetpackworkflow.com/blog. That's jetpackworkflow.com/blog. We'll link up the book. We'll link up the frameworks or questions that John mentioned. If you enjoyed today's interview, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out. If you really appreciate it, something John talked about, share it with a fellow firm owner that needed to hear something John mentioned. John, appreciate you coming on.
Thanks a lot, David. Take care.
Thank you for joining Growing Your Firm, the podcast series for global, small, and medium-sized businesses ready to scale and increase profits. You can check out more podcasts by following the links in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening. At Jetpack Workflow, we're all about maximizing returns for accounting firms and CPAs. Check out more podcasts on growing your firm and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.